January 20, 1983, Lincolnwood, Illinois. Alan Dorfman crossed a parking lot outside the Purple Hotel. Seconds later, gunfire dropped him where he stood. The Chicago outfit avoided scenes like this. Exposure meant risk, but by 1982, federal surveillance had begun mapping the system from the inside. Dorfman wasn't a street figure. He was a financial link between unions, casinos, and organized networks. In casino, this moment barely registers. In reality, it signaled something far more dangerous. So what changed so drastically that the outfit broke its own rules to stop him? The man hidden in plain sight. In Casino, Alan Dorfman appears briefly, almost incidental. The real figure operated at the center of a far larger system. Born in Detroit in 1923 and raised in Chicago, Illinois, he moved from a modest start into a position that linked union institutions with organized crime networks. By the 1950s, he was running an insurance agency tied to the Teamsters, processing claims for workers across multiple states. On paper, it was legitimate business. In practice, it placed him inside a structure where money, influence, and access overlapped. Dorfman was not known for violence or street-level authority. His role was different. He controlled relationships between union officials, financial channels, and individuals connected to the Chicago outfit. Congressional investigations later described those links in detail, outlining how union funds and organized crime interests intersected through a small group of intermediaries. Dorfman was one of them. He rarely appeared in public disputes. He did not need to. His value came from what he could authorize and where he could direct money. Within that system, decisions made in offices on Chicago's northwest side could affect projects hundreds of miles away. To outside observers, he looked like an administrator. Inside the network, he functioned as a gatekeeper. The scale of his influence was not visible in headlines or films. It was embedded in the flow of capital that moved quietly through the system he helped maintain. The money pipeline. From truck drivers to casino, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund stood among the largest labor-managed pools of capital in the United States during the mid-20th century. It held retirement contributions from hundreds of thousands of drivers and warehouse workers across the Midwest. On paper, the mandate was clear: invest in stable projects that would protect long-term benefits. In practice, a portion of that money moved through more complex channels. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, loans from the fund were directed toward large developments, including casino properties in Las Vegas, Nevada. These transactions passed through formal approval processes, but later investigations found that several recipients maintained ties, direct or indirect, to organized crime networks. Among the most prominent beneficiaries was the Argent Corporation, which controlled properties such as the Stardust Resort and Casino. Dorfman operated within the structure that influenced how these funds were allocated. He was not the sole authority, but his position connected union leadership, financial intermediaries, and investment targets. Decisions made in Chicago, Illinois could shape projects hundreds of miles away. What appeared as routine lending carried broader implications. The arrangement blurred boundaries. Official records reflected legitimate financing, while a parallel outcome emerged: projects capable of generating cash flows beyond standard reporting. This dual function became central to the system's expansion. The structure did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on the ability to operate within legitimate frameworks while directing outcomes that served a different set of interests. If you want to see why this wasn't just another hit and what it exposed, stay with this. The enterprise. How the skim actually worked. Inside the casinos of Las Vegas, Nevada, everything appeared controlled, measured, and accounted for. Cash moved from gaming tables and slot machines into counting rooms where teams of employees sorted, verified, and prepared the day's intake for official reporting. On paper, this process defined the business. In practice, it created a point of access. The skim happened before the final numbers were locked in. A portion of the cash was quietly set aside, removed before it could be recorded in the casino's books. This was not a random act or a single decision. It followed a structured routine. Specific individuals handled the extraction, often working within normal operations so nothing appeared out of place. The money was then packaged in a way that allowed it to move without attracting attention, leaving the counting room through controlled channels. From there, the process shifted into logistics. Couriers transported the cash out of Nevada, moving it across state lines, using methods designed to avoid detection. The path varied, but the destination remained consistent: Chicago, Illinois. Once it arrived, the funds could be divided and distributed through established relationships. Figures like Frank Rosenthal focused on maximizing casino performance, ensuring that revenue streams remained strong and predictable. At the same time, Tony Spilotro maintained order, dealing with internal issues and protecting the operation from interference on the ground. Each part of the system depended on the others. Timing had to be precise, roles had to remain defined, exposure had to stay limited. To the public and regulators, the casinos operated within legal frameworks. Behind that surface, a parallel flow of money moved steadily, linking daily gambling activity in Las Vegas to a broader financial structure centered elsewhere. The protection layer: politics, unions, and legitimacy. A system of this scale could not rely on secrecy alone. It required conditions that allowed it to function without constant disruption. Those conditions were built through influence across unions, business networks, and political institutions. In Chicago, Illinois, and Las Vegas, Nevada, these relationships formed a layer that made the operation more durable. Union structures played a central role. Financial activity tied to pension funds carried an appearance of legitimacy. Loans, investments, and transactions were processed through formal channels, supported by documentation that aligned with standard practices. This made the movement of large sums appear routine, even when the underlying purpose was more complex. At the same time, regulatory systems did not always act as strict barriers. Oversight depended on individuals, inspectors, licensing boards, and officials who had discretion in how rules were applied. In some cases, federal investigations later pointed to connections between these decision-makers and figures tied to the broader network. Allegations of bribery and preferential treatment emerged in court proceedings, particularly in cases involving efforts to influence legislation or regulatory outcomes. Some details were established through recorded evidence. Others remained contested or incomplete. What mattered was the pattern. Enforcement was uneven, and certain activities continued without immediate interruption. This environment allowed the enterprise to operate in plain sight. Casinos expanded, investments continued, and financial flows remained active. The line between legal and illegal became difficult to define from the outside. It was not a single point of protection, but a web of overlapping interests, each reinforcing the stability of the system and making direct intervention more complicated. The first failure: when violence could no longer contain risk. Chicago, Illinois, 1974. Federal prosecutors moved forward with a fraud case tied to loans issued from the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. The charges centered on a scheme involving millions of dollars directed into a plastics company in New Mexico. Several individuals were named, including figures connected to the Chicago outfit. The case depended heavily on one cooperating witness: Daniel Seifert, a businessman who had been directly involved and was prepared to testify. On September 27, 1974, Seifert was shot and killed outside his factory in Bensenville, Illinois. The attack was direct and calculated. With the primary witness gone, the structure of the case weakened immediately. Without his testimony, prosecutors lost a key source linking the financial transactions to criminal intent. Charges against several defendants were reduced or dismissed. In the short term, the strategy worked. A single act removed the immediate legal threat, but the outcome carried a longer consequence. The killing did not go unnoticed. It reinforced what federal investigators already suspected: that violence was being used not just for control, but as a method of protecting financial operations. Attention increased. Resources followed. Agencies that might have treated the case as limited fraud began to view it as part of a broader pattern. Over time, the approach showed its limits. Eliminating one witness could disrupt a case built on testimony. It could not stop investigations built on records, surveillance, and coordinated federal effort. What had once been an effective way to manage risk began to draw greater scrutiny, setting the stage for a different kind of response from law enforcement. Operation Pendorf. When the system was captured on tape, by the late 1970s, federal investigators shifted strategy. Instead of relying on witnesses who could be pressured or removed, they turned to surveillance. In 1979, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched Operation Pendorf, a large-scale electronic monitoring effort focused on Alan Dorfman's offices and communications in Chicago, Illinois. The operation required careful planning. Agents entered offices after hours to install listening devices, placing microphones in locations where conversations could be captured without detection. Telephone lines were monitored under court authorization. Over the course of more than a year, The system recorded thousands of hours of audio conversations involving union officials, business associates, and individuals tied to organized crime networks. What emerged from those recordings was detailed and consistent. Discussions covered financial arrangements, efforts to influence political decisions, and interactions that suggested coordination between different parts of the network. One focus of the investigation involved attempts to offer benefits to a United States senator in exchange for legislative action. The evidence did not rely on interpretation alone. It was preserved in recorded exchanges. This shift changed the balance. Information that once existed only within private conversations was now documented and reviewable. It could be presented in court without depending on a single individual's testimony. The same structure that had allowed the system to function, regular communication, defined roles, ongoing coordination, also created a record of its activity. For the first time, the operation was no longer hidden behind layers of trust and discretion. It was captured, stored, and prepared for use in a legal setting that could not be disrupted in the same way as before. The liability. A man who could collapse the system. Chicago, Illinois, December 1982. A federal jury returned guilty verdicts against Alan Dorfman and several associates in a bribery case involving attempts to influence federal legislation. He was released on bail while awaiting sentencing, but the legal pressure surrounding him was expanding, not easing. Investigators were pursuing additional lines of inquiry, and prosecutors were preparing further cases that could reach into his business operations and financial records. Dorfman's position had always been defined by access. He understood how large pools of pension fund money had been directed, who had approved those decisions, and how connections between union leadership, business intermediaries, and political figures had been maintained. That knowledge had once given him influence. Now it created exposure. By this stage, the investigation was no longer dependent on a single witness. Operation Pendorf had already produced extensive recorded conversations, supported by financial documentation and corroborating evidence. The remaining variable was not whether information existed, but how much of it would be used and under what circumstances. Sentencing created leverage. In cases involving significant prison time, defendants sometimes reconsider their position. Cooperation could alter outcomes. Refusal carried different risks. Within that environment, Dorfman became more than an individual facing charges. He represented a concentration of information that connected multiple parts of the system. His decisions could affect people far beyond his immediate case. The same structure that had allowed operations to function, shared knowledge, coordinated activity, and financial interdependence, now meant that pressure applied to one point could extend outward. What had once been an asset began to look like a point of instability. The decision point, breaking the rules to survive. January 1983. With sentencing approaching, the situation had tightened. Alan Dorfman was no longer dealing with a single conviction. Additional prosecutions were possible. Financial investigations were active. The risk was no longer contained. It was expanding. For a system built on control, that kind of uncertainty carried its own danger. The Chicago outfit had long avoided actions that attracted immediate attention. Distance was part of its strength. Decisions were made quietly. Outcomes stayed controlled. What happened in Lincolnwood, Illinois broke that pattern. The shooting outside the Purple Hotel took place in daylight, in a public setting where witnesses were present. It introduced exposure at a moment when the system was already under pressure. Contemporary reporting indicates the circumstances surrounding Dorfman's death reflected growing concern that he could reveal sensitive information under legal pressure. The timing pointed to urgency. A quieter approach would have aligned with established practice. A visible act increased risk but removed delay. It happened just days before sentencing, when the possibility of cooperation could not be ignored. Investigators later reviewed how Dorfman arrived at that location and whether others were involved. No definitive ruling has established responsibility. What remains clear is the shift in strategy. The response favored immediacy over caution. It reflected a calculation that waiting carried greater consequences than acting in the open. Final thought. Why killing Dorfman changed nothing. Removing Alan Dorfman did not erase the record he left behind. The surveillance gathered during Operation Pendorf remained intact. Thousands of conversations, financial links, and coordinated actions preserved in detail. In the years that followed, that material supported federal prosecutions against senior figures in the Chicago outfit, including Joseph Aitpa and Joey Lombardo. Convictions followed, and the structure that once moved money quietly between Chicago, Illinois and Las Vegas, Nevada, began to break apart. The system had relied on control over information, over people, over risk. But once that control shifted, it could not be restored by removing one man. The decision to act solved an immediate problem, but it did not change the outcome. If you want to see how other stories were simplified or left incomplete, subscribe and follow along.